da reinsegnare e ristrutturare nella formazione dei professionisti, anche nel mondo del live, ai quali si rivolge ovviamente questo webinar e che mi seguono tramite le pagine del mio blog Il lato oscuro della fase. Parleremo di psicoacustica con David Griesinger, che saluto e ringrazio per la sua preziosa presenza. Hello David. David?
Unmute. There we are. Is that
Okay.
working now?
We can see you.
Good.
Okay. Thanks, David, for your presence here.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, it's okay. Bene, io ho già parlato e prodotto qualche webinar sul tema della psicoacustica, quindi non vorrei tediare ulteriormente gli amici che si sono connessi per seguire questo webinar con David. Potete vedere i webinar da me prodotti sul mio canale YouTube, Fedele De Marco, e quindi do direttamente spazio ai moderatori che hanno preparato la presentazione del webinar e alcune informazioni sul webinar stesso. Do quindi la parola ad Abe. Abe?
Yes. How are you?
We're all good.
Great. So welcome everybody. Just give me 1 sec and I'll bring up my PowerPoint. Okay, so today we have David Griesinger. He is going to be presenting a very interesting talk, and I am glad that I've been able to chat to him about it the last couple of days. Just before we start, I'm going to explain how this webinar works. If I could get everybody to mute and not share their video unless you need to. We have 4 moderators, including myself. We have Alberto Bonardi from Italy. He is a sound engineer specializing in front of house, studio and broadcast. He will be looking after the comments section on Facebook. Then we have Rafael Pereira, and he is a studio and broadcast, he's a system tech, and he will be looking after the chat on Zoom along with myself. Then we have Cesar Pedraza. He's a sound system designer, and he will also be on the Facebook chat. We will, if we have any questions, if you type them into the chat window, we will bring them all up at the end. And that's it. I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Abe Scheele. I'm a sound engineer in Ireland. I mostly work as a sound system design and acoustic consultant, but I'm also a system tech and I mix gigs. So David will be talking about audio proximity and its effect on quality, intelligibility, engagement, localization, and retention.
Big story.
Yeah. So before we start, I would like to give a quick primer on some of the terms that might come up that you might not be familiar with. Some of these terms are used a lot by system design consultants or acousticians, so they may not be familiar. So acousticians have different terms that they use to rate and describe halls. The terms that you commonly see are clarity, envelopment, reverberation, intimacy, warmth and brilliance, spaciousness, loudness, and noise. They have different metrics for rating, and they also have different ways for measuring. But what about proximity and the limit of localization? That's what David will be talking about today. Proximity kind of is what it sounds like. How far away does thing do sounds seem? Then we have speech intelligibility. People use different words to describe speech intelligibility: clarity, how understandable it is, audibility, articulation. The ISO definition says the effectiveness of the understanding of speech. That's an interesting one. Basically, what it means is that it's not just the sound system you use or the acoustics, but also there's the cognizant side. How do we actually hear it, and how does our brain perceive it? The factors that affect speech intelligibility. Bose produced this great graphic, and you can see that it's not just the things that we can control here, but also the language and speed of the person talking will have an impact on how articulate they are. Some Scottish people have said that Irish people shouldn't be giving webinars because you can't understand them. The listener is the same if they're older or if they have natural hearing impairment. That will have an impact on how understandable things are, and also the context. There are factors we can control and factors we can't. The factors we can't control yet: poor diction. I'll demonstrate that now. Poor hearing. Male or female talker. It is different, and you can argue about which is better. Unfamiliar languages or accents. If you are listening to somebody talking that's not in your native language, that will always impact intelligibility, even if you've lived in a country for over 40 years. And then beyond that, we have the volume and size and shape of the room. Most people don't get to control that. There are factors that we can control: the signal to noise ratio, the direct to reverberant ratio, and discrete reflections. We could put up absorbers, for example. The tonal balance of the signal is something we may be able to control. The system bandwidth, distortion, and overall loudness. Good intelligibility doesn't necessarily mean that sound quality, or doesn't necessarily mean good sound quality. Sound quality is subjective. In some circumstances, increasing the distortion can actually improve intelligibility. Paging horns sound like this, but they can be quite intelligible. Good sound quality doesn't necessarily mean intelligibility, the opposite of what I just said. The intelligibility is objective. So we have a speaker on the left that costs a lot more than the speaker on the right. It sounds a lot better, it's a great speaker, but the speaker on the right, even though it sounds like this, might be significantly more intelligible in certain environments. STI is a measure that we regularly use for measuring intelligibility. It's a scale of 0 to 1. 0.75 up to 1 is seen as being excellent. There are several other metrics for measuring intelligibility and clarity. Percentage Alcons, C50, STIPA, and RASTI. They can be predicted, they can be measured, and they can also be worked out with a pen and piece of paper and a calculator. Sadly, intelligibility doesn't necessarily mean that sound is engaging or memorable. And that's where David's talk today is going to be very interesting. David is talking about proximity, which tells us more about what is locatable. It has a huge effect on perceived quality, engagement, retention, and intelligibility. That's the end of that. And now Cesar is going to introduce David.
Hi. Can you hear me? That's great. Hi, Fidel. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. Thanks, Abe, Rafael, Alberto, and thanks to everyone who is already joining us today. I'd like to do a brief presentation for Dr. David today we're going to enjoy a really great presentation about the physics of auditory proximity and its effects on intelligibility and recall. So Dr. David is a physicist who works in the field of sound and music. He is fascinated by the relationship between mathematical science and the recording, reproduction, and perception of music. At the same time, he was studying at Harvard. He was also working as a recording engineer, where he learned how important the room acoustics in recording techniques is. After completing his PhD in physics in 1978, he developed one of the first digital reverberation devices, later to become the legendary Lexicon 224 reverberator. Since then, Dr. David was the principal scientist at Lexicon for over 30 years, where he was in charge for the algorithm design of many products like the Laris reverberation enhancement system and the Logic 7 surround system. In addition to that, he has made very important research into perception and measurement of acoustical properties of concert halls and opera houses, and has given several lectures and papers on recording, perception, and REM acoustics around the world. Dr. David obtained the gold medal of the German Tonmeister Society and the silver medal of the Audio Engineering Society, participating also as a paper reviewer for the same institution, the ASA and the Acta Acustica. His current work is on the mechanisms the ear and the brain use to perceive the sound and how these mechanisms are affected by the acoustics in hall, operas, and classrooms of all types. All this work is possible because Dr. David all the time was wondering why he was hearing what he was hearing and what was the physics behind the perception and of their reverberation. So today we're going to enjoy a really great presentation. We're going to take a look how important is the proximity for the attention and how we can get a total different experience in concert halls. And just for finish, I would like to tell you a very curious data of Dr. David. He says that he doesn't like microphones. Well, he prefers to talk actually directly to the audience when he is in a conference, because he says that in that way you can create a better emotional connection between the audience and the speakers. Something that I think that is completely true. So that's it. Please welcome to Dr. David.
Thank you very much for that great introduction, and I hope I can live up to your expectations. And I could point out that actually I've done a number of talks where I have used a microphone, but used a very highly directional loudspeaker right next to me, more or less, to boost the volume level, and that does. I mean, if you get it close to you. It's as if you are just speaking but louder, and that can be very effective. It's not used that often. So what should I do? Should I go ahead and talk? Okay. What I'm going to be talking about, this is the title, Physics of Auditory Proximity and its Effect on Intelligibility and Recall. Abe, do you want to shall I tell you to switch the slides? Let's.
Yes, please. If you just tell me when to go to the next one.
Go, please. I'll say go. There we go. I want to start with some very recent results. I was at the ISRA conference in Amsterdam last October, and a researcher named Matthew Neal, who's been running along with David Bright a series of quite complex concert hall measurement tests. And to do this, they are actually finally doing concert hall music tests correctly, which is they set up an electronic orchestra with a separate speaker for every instrument. And then they do impulse responses from each speaker to a listening position, all separately. And then they convolve each of those impulse responses with music from anechoic music from a particular instrument. And they add that all together, and if you reproduce that somehow, it sounds very real. And unfortunately, most previous work with concert hall acoustics used sources on the stage that are very not real. And a lot of mistakes were made. In Neil's experiments, they reproduced these recordings in an anechoic chamber with, I think it's 22 or 25 loudspeakers in a sphere around the listener. I have not heard this setup, but people who have say that it's very convincing, and that's good. Well, what he presented in Amsterdam is the results. And what you do when you do these experiments is you give the listeners a whole bunch of terms to describe what they're hearing and what they like. And it turns out that when you plot all that data together, 75% of all the perception, that is to say the good, bad perception of each seat in the concert hall, could be described by a single word, and that was proximity. That is to say, these listeners were almost unanimous in preferring the sound to actually sound close, that you were close enough to the orchestra to hear each instrument. And this was considered to be the highest virtue of a concert hall. And then he said, there's no measure for proximity. Next slide. Well, that caused me to stand up and say, well, there is a measure for proximity, and I've been talking about it since 2004, and I'm surprised that you don't seem to be aware of it. But anyway, let's go on. What is auditory proximity? Well, the first person to coin this word is Tapiolokki from Aalto University in Finland. And concerning concert halls, he did the same kind of experiment, not as complex as Neil's, but very similar. An interesting fact is that neither definition nor reverberance nor EDT, early decay time, NC80, and he might as well have gone on to name all the other things that Abe just told you about, explain preference at all. When you do the experiment right, nobody cares about these things. In contrast, preference is best explained with subjective proximity, along with bassiness, envelopment, and loudness to some extent. Further, there is no objective measure that correlates to proximity and overall average of preference. Well, again, there is one. And this is, he found that perception he named proximity. And I've been calling it something, engagement, clarity, or presence since 2004. And I believe it to be measurable. Next slide. Well, something else we discovered while doing our experiments is that this perception called proximity is not continuous. In other words, you either have it or you don't, which was very surprising to me, but you can show this in experiments over and over again. We find that in halls, if you shut your eyes and walk away from a sound source, the proximity, the sense of having it right in front of you and localizing it sharply, disappears at a particular distance, within about a meter. So if you're in a concert hall at one seat and you move back to the next seat behind that, suddenly it's all gone. And the image of the orchestra becomes just a big ball of sound. And instead of being separate instruments. Okay, well, you can map out in a hall where this change in sound takes place, and you can calculate or find the number of seats or the percentage of seats that are proximate and the percentage that aren't. And nobody does this, but I think it would be a very good idea. Next slide. I can demonstrate this, and with a little bit of help from Abe. I was in a concert hall in Puerto Rico, and I happen to know the players, which is the Pacifica String Quartet. And they said, sure, go ahead and do this. So I recorded binaurally right behind the lady in red in the picture here, them playing a little bit of Haydn, I think. Abe, these two things start with a little bit of silence, so you can just pop it forward a little bit. Play the first one. This seat, I believe, is proximate. First violin is clearly on the left and the cello is clearly on the right, and they seem proximate. Okay, Abe, stop. Okay, so now we're going to move just 5 rows further back. I could have moved only 2 rows further back, but I was trying to make sure that this would work. So here's just 5 rows further back, and Abe stepped forward quite a bit because this starts very slow and it's more useful later. I don't know about what you hear, but I can't hear any separation between the instruments at all. They're all a big fuzzy ball. So that's enough. We can have the next slide. So that was a demonstration that the LLD exists and is there. It's interesting because the people who designed that hall were there at the time. And they were walking around during rehearsals and they listened to the concert too. And so I said, did any of you notice this? And they said, no, it sounds great everywhere we go. It's just wonderful. Of course, they built it, so they should know. But they didn't hear it. So the question is why? Well, it turns out that if you're looking at the players, you are absolutely positive you're hearing them. And if you see them, the violin on the left, you're going to hear it on the left. That's the way the brain works. So to actually find the LLD, you have to shut your eyes or avert your eyes from the people playing. And I think you can say, well, if you think it's right, then it's good enough. You don't need to worry about it. And the answer to that is no, because I think when the sound is proximate, you remember it, you're engaged to it, you have to listen to it in some sense because it's close enough that your brain says, I have to listen to this. And that's important. So a way of testing this, you can set up a little electronic orchestra on the stage and you don't have to shut your eyes because you can't see which speaker is playing. Okay, and so we do this, and if you play just a little bit of the next thing, I use this signal. Okay, that's enough. Well, that's the first and second violins in Loki's anechoic recording of Mozart. And if you put 2 speakers on stage and you play that and walk away from it, at some point you can't tell which instrument is playing which note. And that's also very clear. So, next slide. So why is this important? And this is where I really think I'm trying to make something that's important here. And I'm trying to change the way people think about sound, really. When sound is perceived as close to a listener, it demands attention. And muddy sound, sound that is not proximate, can be more easily ignored. This is really important. And Carl Wyman, who was a PhD physicist who got the Nobel Prize, actually, went to Colorado State where he was teaching the introductory course in physics with Catherine Perkins. And they decided to do an experiment on this. And so they randomly assigned seats in a large classroom for this course to students. And then they divided these groups of students into 4 groups based on the distance to the teacher. And then they tracked class participation, quiz results, and grades. They also tracked at the end of the course whether the students thought the course was interesting and maybe would consider going into physics. And it turns out the students in the front half of the room did better in all aspects, more participation, more questions, and better grades by full grade level. And at the semester break, Carl Wyman et al. Switched the positions of the seats. So the people in the rear came to the front and vice versa. But the people that started the course in front retained their advantage. Next slide. Here's the data. I don't have to go through it, but it's very impressive and very alarming. Here we're plotting the performance of these different groups as a function of where they were sitting. And the performance is really quite impressive. The people in front do better in all cases. So next slide. So I think that the acoustics in classrooms is quite important. So I gave a talk in Indianapolis for the Acoustical Society some years ago, and I decided I would make a model of a classroom. And so this is a classroom which is 27 feet long by 25 feet wide by 10 feet high. And I gave it an average surface absorption of 0.15, which gives a reverberation time of 0.034 or 0.34 seconds. That's a short reverberation time. And then I listened to it with a binaural rendition from a teacher. So I have the teacher at 9.5 feet in the front and 6 feet from the side walls. And then these listeners at the position shown in the graph. And Abe, can you play the one on the bottom, the one closest to the teacher?
To be suitable to the needs of modern concert music, a hall must accommodate a great variety of styles. Music of the transparent, intellectual type.
Okay, and now if you could look at that, you can see that STI for all these seats is almost identical, and it's considered very good. And it's true that the intelligibility is very good, but the sense of presence or proximity is very different in these different seats. Try the next one up, the 13.8.
To be suitable to the needs of modern concert music, a hall must accommodate a great variety of styles. Music of the transparent.
That's enough. Now play the last one. No, the third from the last. The second from the last. There you go.
To be suitable to the needs of modern concert music, a hall must accommodate a great variety of styles. Music of the transparent.
I hope you can hear that. The intelligibility is in fact quite good. STI measuring speech intelligibility is quite good, but the difference in sound is very large. Play the first one again, the one at 10.4 feet.
To be suitable to the needs of modern concert music, a hall must accommodate a great variety of styles. Music of the transparent.
That one grabs your attention. At least that's my contention that it does. These experiments in small rooms are not as dramatic as they are in concert halls, but I think they're still important. Try the next slide. What can be done in a concert hall? You try to the LOC measure actually shows you this. What you really want to do in a concert hall is to limit the earliest reflections as best you possibly can, because these are the strongest and they have the largest effect on proximity. And in this room, I tried that for the room that you just heard, and deleting the first reflections made hardly any difference at all. The best solution for this classroom is to just increase the absorption. Impractical but effective. Go to the next slide. So here's the same room, but I've just made it more absorptive. The reverb time now is 0.26 instead of 0.3 something. But the difference in proximity, look at the LOC figures. LOC in the front is now 8.5 and a little bit further down. Basically, these are all pretty good. Play the 1 second from the teacher, the 5.1 as an example.
To be suitable to the needs of modern concert music, a hall must accommodate a great variety of styles.
Okay, that's good enough. That voice to me is just right in front of you. You just have to listen to it. And the other seats are not quite as good, but they're still interesting. Next slide. Well, why did we not discover proximity sooner? I mean, this is very important, but acoustics seems to have completely missed it. And there's a couple of reasons. There probably is more than two, but anyway, here's what's on the slide. Proximity describes the perception that sound is sonically close to the listener, and you have to listen without a visual image. Concert hall study after concert hall study has been done with people with their eyes open, or with questionnaires that you fill out after the concert. The questionnaires are extremely questionable because acoustic memory is so known to be so short. But people are listening to the concert with their eyes open. Well, that's okay, actually. If you just want to have an enjoyable time and listen to some pretty music, it works just fine. But if you're actually interested in the music and interested in its intricacies of design and what the composer was really interested in saying, you need the proximity. But the other problem is that most laboratory experiments that were done in before the last 10 years when, or 6 or 7 years when Tapio Loki did his, most of these experiments simply didn't reproduce it. And many previous experiments used a single speaker or just 2 speakers to reproduce an entire orchestra. So there was no proximity to be heard. Next slide. In fact, Barron and Marshall's classic paper, which is in all the textbooks, Spatial Impression on the Effect of Early Reflections, used a single speaker to reproduce a whole orchestra. And of course, when people listened to this, it sounded like, guess what? A single speaker reproducing a whole orchestra. Did it sound like an orchestra? No. Okay, so they said, let's add some early reflections. Maybe it will sound more like an orchestra if we add lots of early reflections. So they did. And Barron published this paper and said, we need lots of early reflections to make good sound in a concert hall, and we've just proved it. The trouble is, adding the early reflections makes apparent source width, which is just what you don't want. You want to be able to sharply localize each instrument, and you add reflections, and you can't. And yes, it sounds like a concert hall more, but it's a bad concert hall. It's not a good one. So, and most of the ISO 3382 measures, which are the ones we mentioned at the beginning of this talk, were developed using similar kinds of experiments. Next. Just for fun, it turns out that if you actually listen to something, you hear the difference for proximity right away. And Edison, back in 1916, invented what he called the diamond disc phonograph, which is, look at the picture, you can see that what this is a turntable. It's hand cranked. It's a hand cranked turntable. The discs are 1/4 inch thick, very deeply cut, and that played with a diamond that sits right on the center of a diaphragm, which connects to an exponential horn. This is basically a linear phase system, hard coupled to the grooves in the disc with a diamond. And they're cut with a similar kind of setup, with the singer shouting into the horn. And I heard one of these phonographs in a museum, a very small museum up in Vermont called, I can't remember, it's something called the Measure Mill. And the man who ran it had one of these, and he was willing to play it for me. And he put the soprano on, and bingo, it was like this woman was standing right in front of me. I was absolutely blown away. It sounded exactly as Edison said it would. The piano on the recording, of course, sounded terrible, but the soprano was super. And people who do electronic orchestras, Wisław Wacek, Kimio Hamazaki, Richard Campbell, all found the same thing. To make a orchestra that sounds like an orchestra, you got to have a separate speaker for each voice. Next slide. So Loki and Neil succeeded in detecting proximity by following these rules. Reproduce each instrument through a single loudspeaker as close as possible to the original azimuth, and then use an independent anechoic chop to play back each instrument. Next slide. Well, close or attention grabbing might also be descriptors for proximity. Sounds that have proximity are perceived as close to a listener, both in natural hearing and in the sound mix. Sounds with proximity pop forward out of background sound and other instruments in a recording. Recording engineers know all about this. They just don't call it that. They might call it, I don't know, presence, perhaps. Not proximity, but recording engineers know what they're doing. Why? Because typically recordings are played without a visual image. You don't have that crutch. The sound has got to do what the eyes might otherwise do. Our brains involuntarily pay attention to close sounds. These may predict danger. Close sounds are also easier to interpret and remember. Next slide. Well, okay, what's the mechanism? How does the ear do this? We know within 1/10 of a second or so whether a sound is proximate or not. How do we know that? Okay, no current hearing model can explain this distance perception effect. That is not all. No current hearing model can duplicate our abilities to understand speech in noisy environments, which is a vital ability for survival. Something vital is missing from standard models of hearing. Now, I have to point out that the machine learning recognition of speech is getting very good. But I just read an article about that in one of the journals I read. And the author of that article pointed out that people recognize this kind of problem by actually getting what was said. They managed to pull the speech itself away from the noise somewhere in the ear or the brain before they tried to interpret it. Whereas the machine language programs work with grammar and probability of different words in sentence structure. So the machines are doing it a different way. People are doing it directly. They hear better. So next slide. Why do they hear better? Well, it turns out here we have another big mistake in acoustic research and hearing research. And that is what's missing from these kinds of research is the periodic pulses in sound pressure that are a property of speech in most musical instruments. In other words, when you speak, the vocal cords open periodically with little bursts of air, bump, 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 bump. And that makes pulses of air pressure. And these pulses come at the fundamental frequency, but they exist over the entire frequency range. So even in 3,000 or 4,000 hertz, if you look at the time waveform of speech or music, you see these pulses. And this is universal among animals and other things that communicate with each other by sound. Once in every fundamental period, the harmonics of any signal that has a fundamental period align in phase to create a replica of the original pulse. Next slide, please. All right, here's the syllable one that from me, voiced and then whispered. This is just as a comparison. This is high pass filtered at 1,000 hertz. Okay, so this is all above 1,000 hertz. The one signal there, you can see, has pulses with 20 decibels at least signal to noise ratio. And these are at the fundamental frequency, so play it. Okay, so the first one, the one that's not whispered, you can hear that raspy, sharp pulsing, right? And the ear can too. Well, you hear it because the ear can hear it. That's my point. Now the trouble is most hearing models assume that phase is inaudible above 1,000 hertz or 1,500 hertz, and therefore they eliminate the phase. They just look at spectrograms and they try to understand speech with spectrograms. This is a very bad strategy because the ear uses the pulses. Okay, next slide. But reflections can eliminate these periodic pulses. I've got a sentence here. The first half of this sentence is convolved. The second half of the sentence is convolved with the impulse response you see at the right-hand side, upper. And the first half is not. And you can hear the difference in sound this makes. Play the thing on the, yeah, that one. If I record my voice with a microphone close to my mouth, the sound is very close to the ear of the listener, present, very clear. However, if I scramble the harmonics above 1,000 hertz, the sound is very different. It might be perceived as distant or muddy. So that's pretty much self-explanatory. Next slide. Oh, the point I made in the first slide, in that slide there, is if you measure the sound quality with any of the standard measures, STI, RASTI, whatever, you find out the phase modulation does absolutely nothing. You get exactly the same result. So by standard measures, both of those segments of speech are completely okay, the best you can have them. Okay, well, anyway, more important, perhaps, is that the fact that there are these pulses means that if you have a kind of autocorrelator that is tuned to the fundamental frequency of these pulses, you can separate them from noise with very high signal-to-noise ratio. In other words, you get at least 10 and sometimes 20 decibels of improvement in signal-to-noise ratio if you can autocorrelate these with a correlator that matches the fundamental frequency. And it's clear to me that the ear has this kind of signal. Somebody asked Jens Blauert at a conference, does the ear actually have autocorrelators in it? And he said, oh yes, of course, we've known that for years. Yes, Jens? Well, I'm not so sure. First of all, nobody who studies the neurology of hearing has seen such an autocorrelator in the neural pathways that are available for research in the midbrain. So either they're in the ear itself or we don't know what's happening. So I think they're probably in the ear itself. Next slide. A mechanism, well, here we have to talk about something else. People are known to have a very, very acute sense of pitch. Musicians can tune instruments to, about 3 cents, which is 0.1% in frequencies, which is extraordinary ability. And the question is, why did that evolve? I mean, the evolution doesn't do things for free or for just fun. It's doing it for a very good reason. And this problem fascinated J.C.R. Licklider. If you don't know who he was, look him up. He's basically the person who invented the internet. He's an absolutely brilliant man and a super programmer. He also invented time sharing at both Brannick and Newman, our local company here. Anyway, he proposed in 1951 that the acuity of pitch could only be explained by an autocorrelator located as close as possible to the hair cells. He did not propose that the circuit could also separate sounds from each other, but I think it can. And I believe that this circuit, which is not exactly what he drew, because there are many ways of making an autocorrelator that doesn't look really like that. But anyway, I think he's right about where it exists. Okay, next slide. All right, I'm just as a little a little demonstration. This slide didn't work last time I tried it. Let's see if it does this time. I'm going to speak 2 different sentences with my voice in as close as I can manage to a monotone. One is going to be a semitone higher than the other. So just play it. If you listen, you can decide which one to listen to if you have normal hearing. Go ahead.
This is speech at C sharp below middle C. It is still instantly recognizable as my voice. It is easy to understand every word. And the vowels are of course as clear because the vowel form and frequencies are exactly the same. And to separate this from the pitch at C, you should concentrate on listening to the difference in pitch. This one is somewhat higher.
Okay, well, actually, people have done experiments of this type, and they found you can do this with a half a semitone. And it still works. This example uses a full semitone difference. And then if you play the next little speaker to the right, you'll see what happens if I pass this through the signal through an autocorrelator tuned to one of the voices and not the other.
This is speech at C sharp below middle C. It is still instantly recognizable as my voice, and the vowels are of course as clear because the vowel form and frequencies are exactly the same. To separate this from the pitch at C, you should concentrate on listening to the difference in pitch. This one is somewhat higher.
Okay, well, that just shows that it works. Next slide. I have been working now for 10 years to make a good hearing model that incorporates this kind of thing that runs very fast, and I haven't quite succeeded yet. My thesis here is that if you mess up the phase of upper frequency sounds, of harmonics basically, then the speech becomes very difficult to hear, particularly in noise. And a guy named Aarabi, who at once, I think he was at Carnegie Mellon when he did this, decided to test this in a simple way by taking a standard word list, speech signal, FFTing that, and then adding a whole lot of noise. So the input to this is speech with noise, and a lot of noise. He's going like 10 dB more white noise than the speech level. And he's going to FFT the result, and he's going to take the phase component of that FFT and do a crossfade with random noise. So the phase is either the original phase or totally random noise with some parameter alpha, okay? And then he's going to reconstruct the signal and have people listen to it. Next slide. Well, it turns out that with the amount of noise he uses, and these are 3 different levels of noise, fairly high levels of noise, it turns out that the listeners do pretty well until the phase noise is half random noise and half original, which is plus or minus 90 degrees peak phase modulation. That's at 0.5 in this graph. The graph is a little bit misleading because the data points are only along the 0.4, 0.5, 0.6 positions, and the interpolation between them is rather arbitrary. But in any case, you can see that when that phase noise becomes half noise and half real, there's a very quick and very large decrease in the intelligibility of the signal. So that explains why the proximity effect is all or nothing, basically. What Aarabi is showing here, that you either can localize in this situation or suddenly you can't. Next slide. So word recognition versus recall, okay? It's nice to be able to recognize words in speech, but it's even nicer to remember what was said. And word recognition is just the first step. And a primary determinant of recall is attention. So randomization of phase decreases proximity, and the lack of proximity decreases attention and recall. And the next slide, I'll try and show you why. Next slide. Okay, this is just a little diagram here. Where working memory is limited and clarity is essential. Let's just look at the top graph. This is what happens when clarity, well, this was before I had used Loki's word proximity. I'm talking clarity, but you can read proximity. Well, the first step in identifying words and sentences is the sound separation. You've got to get the phonemes out of the noise. So in this case, clarity is high or proximity is high, and sound separation takes only a little bit of time. And then you have to identify the vowel, okay? And the brain does that. And then it has to identify the phoneme. In other words, it has to turn the vowels into a phoneme. And finally, it has to identify the word. It has to look up. Oh, no, it has to identify the senome. That's a term in speech recognition. And once you have the senome, you can identify the word by looking it up in your brain dictionary. And then you can assemble the sentence. Now, this is the best case, all right? But your brain has to do all these steps, and they all take time, okay? And then you have to find the meaning associated with previous experiences and store it, all right? But the result in this case, where we have lots of time for meaning associated and storing, is engagement, focus, and retention. But what happens when clarity is poor? First of all, you don't have good sound separation, so you're dealing with something noisy. Identifying the vowel takes time. And then identifying the phoneme takes even more time. Identifying the senome takes even more time. And then you've got to look it up and find out what about the grammar and the context. And that even takes more time. And then you've got to assemble the sentence, and then, you're out of working memory. The next word has already come, and you've lost it. Okay, so that's what happens. The trouble is your working memory is limited, and as you get older, it gets more and more limited, I can tell you with some assurance. And so you need better and better clarity. So next slide. Well, how can we measure and predict proximity? A practical autocorrelator of the type Licklider proposed needs to be about 80 milliseconds long to achieve human pitch acuity. So we know something already about where we have to start. And if you talk about an autocorrelator with some kind of a tap structure, you need a kind of a minimum of 5. With this knowledge, we have developed a measure called LOC that predicts when a sound becomes distant and not localizable. Next slide. Okay, I'm not going to describe this very much. This was an experiment with a set of data that basically this is my hearing. And I've tried to duplicate this in various laboratories around the world. And it turns out it doesn't duplicate all that well, but people have a bigger spread. But basically, it's pretty much right. And what it's showing here is that when you delay the time before reflections come, that you're able to hear a much worse direct to reverb ratios. Next slide. For example, here's 2 seats in Boston Symphony Hall. This is row R, seat 11. We used to sit in this seat when listening to concerts. It's a good seat. And if you look at C80, it's 0.85 and IACC80 is 0.68. Those measures, unfortunately, don't mean much, but the LOC measure says it's plus 9.1. That's a very good value. So it is a very good seat. Okay, well, we're now going to move back in the hall to row DD, seat 11. And there's, you can see here, a very strong sidewall reflection from the right-hand sidewall. And if we look at the C80 values, it's 0.02. That's not as high as the other seat, but it's still considered good. And the IAC value is 0.2, which most textbooks say is better than 0.68, okay? But the LOC value says it's minus 1.2, which says it stinks. And it does, it stinks. If there's time later, I'll be able to play examples of this for you. Next slide. So here's some experiments. And the question is how you do these experiments. I was a friend of Ning Sheng and Leo Brannick, and Ning and his students from RPI were there, and Leo was there giving a sort of playing God, which he does very well. While Ning was setting up his complex for measuring the standard acoustic measures, I just put a little Genelec by the conductor position and went and recorded impulse responses to a large number of seats, 5 of which are shown in the diagram on the left. And the DD11 is, you can see, is the furthest back, and it's near the sidewall. And if you look at the sound field plot, I realize this is not so easy to see, but what it's showing you is that there's a large reflection from the sidewall at 15 milliseconds. And there it is. I'm sorry, 17 milliseconds. So that's what it is. Next slide, please. Well, okay, I can go through and show you how we take that impulse and actually do a lot of processing to it to compensate for the reverberation time of the hall and other things. Move on to the next slide. So it turns out then you have one impulse response, so you can make the sound of one instrument, but it turns out you can actually make that into a string quartet or a small ensemble really easily by simply taking the direct sound impulse, just the first pulse, and giving it a different azimuth by changing the ITD and the ILD of that impulse, and suddenly you can make a string quartet or a quintet, and that's what I did. So I took that measurement and made a quintet with Tapio Loki's anechoic tracks, and I could listen to it. Next slide. So you turn a crank with MATLAB, and MATLAB generates 3 separate binaural tracks. One is just the direct sound, and it sounds like the direct sound. And one is just that first reflection, okay? And so you can hear the whole string quartet as if you were only hearing that reflection, which is kind of cool. And you can hear the string quartet with the just the direct sound, which sounds very dry, of course, but they're all there and they sound quite real. And you can localize each one. And then a binaural track for the reverberation without the other 2. So if we mix these tracks together with Audition or something, we can recreate the seat, and we can, and it sounds very realistic. So next slide. So I'm going to just play some of these for your edification. If you can play the one for direct only, Abe, this is the direct only. That's enough, Abe. Okay, so you can hear it actually. If you have stereo when you're listening or headphones or something, you should hear the violins on the left and the singer in the middle and the cello on the right. And that's all the way it should be, okay? Well, now we're going to play the first reflection only. This is from the right-hand side wall, same group. That's enough. Well, if you've had some sound engineering experiences, you probably know, well, not only is that on the right, it's kind of muddy. It doesn't have a good timbre. And the reason for that is that sidewall reflection is actually a double. The sound bounces off the ceiling of the under balcony and then to you, and it also bounces directly off the wall and comes to you, and there's a time delay. So it's got a kind of comb filter to it. This is not good. So play the next one, which is the direct sound and the first reflection together. Okay. This is not better, is all I can say. All right, now we'll forget the reverb only. Let's play them all together. this is what you actually hear in that seat. Well, it's not very good. Now, I'm going to just delete, I'm going to play the direct sound and the reverb and forget about this sidewall reflection. So let's do that. Well, my point here is that that seat just went from a $60 seat to a $100 seat. At least it would for me, because without that sidewall reflection, that's a good seat. I would be happy to sit there during a concert and enjoy it very much. Whereas with the reflection, it's kind of muddy and very disappointing. Okay, next slide. Well, okay, this shows you the difference in LOC. Sorry. Okay, if we look at the LOC in the left ear with all the reflections there, that's what's in the left box there. LOC is very high, it's 6.7. But the right ear is of a different story. With that reflection, you can see that exactly at 17 milliseconds, the reverberant energy pops up. The red, I should say here, the red curve is the energy in the reverberation and reflections, and the blue curve is the energy in the direct sound. And you can see in the right ear that the presence of that reflection boosts the reverberant energy way high, really fast. And then the LOC factor goes way down. However, in the right panel, if I delete that reflection, the LOC in the right ear is also very good. And so when I delete the reflection, it's a very good seat. But we learn from this that that basically the LOC value in the lesser of the two ears is dominant. You really need binaural rehearing to be able to separate these signals with the regular kind of brain. Next slide. Well, I just very quickly, I'm going to play another one. I'm just going to play all together. This is this is row 2, balcony row 2, seat 26, which is a very good seat, actually. You're looking down at the orchestra. It's very clear. There are no sidewall reflections to bother you. And if we play the second from the bottom, you'll hear what that seat sounds like. Yeah, okay, so next slide. I've been lecturing on this all over the world, and I had some success actually with Baby Müller. I gave a private talk to him and his chief physicist, whose name is Gunnar Engel, who's become a good friend of mine at this point. And he bought it. He said, you know, what you're saying is right. That was, I won't go into the whole story, but this was very gratifying to me. And somewhat later, Gunnar Engel got the opportunity to work with an orchestra named Hammerl to design this unusual hall in Bleibach, Germany. It's a small hall, it's only 200 seats. And it's a shoebox that's tilted up on its end like that, you can see on the left-hand side. And the interesting thing about it is there are many reflectors on the sidewalls and the ceiling, and they are all tilted in such a way that no first-order reflection comes to the audience. Believe it or not, that's possible. And it's fantastic. A 200-seat hall with the reverberation time of, I think it's 1.8, would normally sound like nothing you'd want to hear music in. It would be muddy and, you know, smeary and just not good at all. This one is gorgeous, according to everybody. And I have some binaural data from it, which would tend to prove that. In any case, I look forward to seeing it sometime. It is possible to design a small hall with excellent sight lines, a longish reverberation time, and really excellent sound. Next slide. So this is that hall, but I'm going to skip that actually for this time. Let's move on. Well, we've finally come around to a chance for conclusions. I've not gone too far over my time, but proximity, the perception that a source is acoustically close, is an important determinant of attention and recall. The presence or absence of proximity in particular seats can be determined by listening for the localization of instruments in a small, usually electronic ensemble. The ear detects proximity through the phase coherence of upper harmonics in the direct sound, which are randomized by early reflections. I could say something about phase response because actually Abe asked me about it. He says, what does this apply to loudspeakers? And does the reason that people worry about phase response in the upper harmonics of loudspeakers has something to do with this? And the answer to that is, I don't know, really. I think the fact that we can hear small differences in the phase response of loudspeakers and prefer ones that are as linear as possible is due to the same mechanism. We have the hardware for hearing it, but the hardware for hearing it is for speech separation from noise and reflections. And it's quite robust. You have to have a pretty bad speaker before the speaker messes that up to the extent where you can't hear proximity. But a good speaker sounds like a good speaker because this mechanism can detect that. All right, binaural technique with individual headphone equalization, I'll talk about that briefly in a minute, is a practical standard under which other hall research techniques can be judged. And I've been working on, for the last 10 years or so, how to equalize headphones to match an individual through loudness matching. And the difference that when you do that is quite astounding. We now have little apps for doing that. I think within probably a month or so, they'll be available on both the Apple and Google Play stores for cell phones. We have a working AAX, but at the moment, the Avid web store seems to be down. We can't get through, but it should be available from the Apple website for professionals who want to use it. Okay, so I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Another conclusion is existing binaural data equalized to yield a very good snapshot of the sound of an ensemble in a particular seat. And the data can be further manipulated to discover why the sound is good or how to improve it if it is not. One of the problems with Loki's work and Neil's work is that they definitely have data that shows proximity or no proximity, and people really prefer it. And that's, people really prefer proximity. But they haven't gone to the next step. They can, with that data, easily change the strength of individual reflections or change the direct reverberant ratio or any of these other things and determine why the sound is either proximate or not. And they might be very helpful in improving the way we calculate LOC, which is just a work in progress at this point. But for some reason, that doesn't seem to interest them. And basically, I think they wanted to do what they did and get their degree and go. I hope that at some point, somebody will take up the task, besides me, that is, of using this kind of data to say why we get proximity and not, and what can you do about it. Using these techniques, we found that the first order lateral reflections in Boston City Hall are excessive. Many of them are doubles, and that's part of the reason. In every seat we tested, they're either inaudible or they reduce or eliminate proximity. Deleting them improves both clarity in the music and the sound of the hall with no decrease in loudness. So this is important to know. Next slide. Oh.
That's it, I think.
I don't have those slides because I didn't put them in. Well, go back up a little bit, or go back up and I'll make a very brief description of the work I have. Anybody who's not familiar with my website could remember that davidgriesinger.com, but you have to know how to spell Griesinger, Griesinger.com, all one word, is an interesting place to go. And it describes our new apps that allow you to equalize headphones to an individual. And if you haven't done that, please do, because the apps are very interesting. At this point, I've probably demonstrated them to 100 people, including people like Jens Blauert and Dorte Hammershøi, who was delighted to do the experiment, even though she's a very strong believer that you should measure everything at the entrance to the ear canal. And I think that's totally wrong because the sound at the entrance to the ear canal is not what you hear at the eardrum. The ear has no way, the ear and brain has no way of knowing what the sound at the entrance to the ear canal is. And over your lifetime, you've learned to use the sound at your eardrum to understand sound. And if you alter the timbre of that, you aren't going to be able to do that anymore. Okay, so I guess that's it.
Great.
Questions?
Very much. Have we any questions?
Must be some.
You're looking for? Okay. No questions yet.
Well, I'm here. I realize it's a lot of slides. The slides are also on my website if you want to listen to them over again. Please do.
Okay, Dr. David, while we are waiting for questions, I'd like to do a comment and a question.
Sure.
And later a question. And I was really curious about the way you were talking about how the score of the students can change in the classrooms. That's really amazing. That's really, really amazing. And I was really curious about it. And now talking about the phase response, I also have heard that humans, we can hear the phase response in speakers. In that sense, I was really curious. Do you think that a loudspeaker with a better phase response is going to be useful for get a better, not get a better sound, but get a better understanding of the voice or music or whatever?
Yeah, I do think that good speakers sound better.
But I mean, with a flat phase response. I mean, with a flat phase response, do you think it's going to be?
Yeah. I tried to make the point when I was talking. Of course, there's so many points; it's hard to remember one. That what you really want is the time structure of speech and music to be not severely altered by the speaker. Okay. So actually, you could test for this by simply taking male speech. Male speech works better than female, and looking just high pass filter it, and say 1,000 hertz, and look at the time structure. You should get these very sharp pulses, and they should be clear. And if you do, then the speaker will probably have reasonably good proximity. That doesn't mean it will really sound good, but in my experience. Yeah. The better, the more linear the phase response is, the better the speaker sounds. It doesn't have to be a horn, although I'm always amazed by the fact, well, Edison did his diamond disc phonograph using a horn, of course. You know, that was the only choice, really, but he did it really right. It was a very good horn, and the drive for the horn was also very direct and very clean. And with that, he can make it sound very realistic. Then when talkie movies came in, people at Bell Labs did the same kinds of experiments. And they decided that the best way to reproduce dialogue was with these voice of the theater horns. So you have a large subwoofer, basically, below a very large horn with a linear compression driver. And that was the standard in movie theaters for 40 years, you know? And the reason is that it sounds very proximate. I've never particularly liked the timbre of these things, but boy, it grabs you. Okay. And now people are using more sophisticated speakers, but they have to have that grabbing quality, or movie directors won't use them, because that's what they wanted. I'll enlarge on that again. It's an interesting story. The question is, how did I learn about proximity? I had to be taught. It wasn't obvious to me that proximity was where it was at for a lot of things, music and opera and speech. And this happened the first time that was really strong. Steve Barber and I, no, it wasn't Steve Barber, it was me and the Tonmeister at the Deutsche Staatsoper in Berlin, which had just opened to the West audiences after the wall came down. And I was asked to see if I could raise the reverberation time electronically, which of course we can do with the layer system. And I went over on spec at my own expense and brought some equipment, and I found great piles of East German sound equipment there that the Tonmeister Krieger had already installed. And so I set up a layer system using existing stuff in the theater and a couple of Schoeps microphones. And it worked. So I had to adjust it. And I'm a singer, so I got on stage and sang away. But I was more or less in the forestage of the opera house with the stage relatively empty, but with some curtains, because the stage has curtains, you can't take them away. Krieger was out in the audience listening to it, and he'd say, this is good, this is not good, we need more, we need less. So we adjusted the system so that it sounded really good on my voice. And then Barenboim came in to do the first rehearsal of Rheingold's, because he had convinced the Berlin City Council that he wanted to do the Ring. And he was going to, the first Ring performance in Germany since World War II, incidentally. So he did Rheingold. And so he got in the podium, and there was an orchestra there, and they had a few singers on the stage. And it was the Rhine Maiden's turn. So we had, I forget what's his name, the dwarf, and the Rhine Maiden singing. So Barenboim was very pleased with what he was hearing from the podium. So he jumped out of the pit and started walking around the hall. And he walked around the hall for about 5 minutes. And then he said, stop, stop, it's horrible, turn it off, I can't stand it.
Sure.
And I went to Mr. Barenboim and said in my best German, Mr. Barenboim, sir, could you possibly tell me why you don't like the sound? He says, I can't hear the singers, turn it off. I'll give you 20 minutes to fix it or it's out. So that's Barenboim.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I ran up to the studio, which is 5 flights above the stage, and looked at the equalizers and said, aha, he can't hear the singers. Most of the intelligibility of his singers is above 1,000 hertz. And the most of what he wants to hear in the orchestra is below 1,000 hertz. So there was the main mic equalizer there, and I simply lowered the level above 1,000 hertz by 6 decibels and went back down. He jumped back into the pit, conducted, came out, listened, so he was happy as a clam. He said, that's perfect, never change it. That wasn't a good thing to say because we couldn't change it for 20 years. but eventually when they tore the place down, they took it out. But that's when I learned that being able to hear the singers was related to upper harmonics of what they were singing. And if you were doing reverberation enhancement, you had to be very careful about this. And that was a first for me.
Absolutely. It seems we have some questions, right, Abe?
Yes, we have a few questions, a few good questions. Can you talk a bit more about this app and how it works? It will be available also as a plugin in all the standard formats, VST, A, XX, AU, question mark.
Yeah. Well, I wrote the app in just C language using an ASIO set of code that was written for me by Tom Flaherty 25 years ago now, and it still runs. So it's what I use when I want to model something that I'm working on. And that app is available to anybody who wants it. It's on my website. You can send me an email. You need a Windows computer and you need an ASIO interface to make it work. But so at some point I wanted to be able to make it more general. And I looked around for somebody, and it just so happened that a former colleague of mine, Kirk Bushen, recently had left Harman because they wanted him to move to Detroit, and he was not interested in that. So I asked him if he would be interested in working on this app, and he said he was. And he had knowledge of the code programming called Juice, J-U-C-E, which is a software envelope that you can put around a piece of code and make it compatible with AAX and VST and Apple and Android. So after quite a bit of work, actually, and he was able to get this all working. And it is now working. In fact, I have the version for Apple. Apple has approved it, and they'll put it on their website, they say, as soon as I can supply them a video. But the video has to be workable with Bluetooth. In other words, you need to have Bluetooth working for the reference speaker, and you need to have Bluetooth working for the headphones you're trying to equalize. And I tried to get that working, and I couldn't do it. So Kirk helped me out again, and now I'm able to do that, but I haven't made the video. So that's the next thing I'll be working on. I should describe what the app does. And I put some slides on the on this my website, which I was hoping to have here, but I'll have to just describe them. It turns out, as I said before, we hear at our eardrums. We do not hear at the entrance to the eardrums. We hear everything that we do hear at the eardrums, okay? And the question is, okay, the next point is that if you ask a hearing doctor about the ear canals, and they will say that everybody's ear canal is different. They're like fingerprints, he says. The same genes that control the facial features to be different for every person makes the ear canals different for every person too. The reason that that matters is the timbre that you get at the eardrum from a signal outside. Well, I'm interested in the signal from the front. Is very different for different individuals, plus or minus 10 dB easy between 1,000 hertz and 6,000 hertz, which is where it really matters. So everybody hears differently. Now, everybody has had a long time to know how their ears work. They have been living with them a long time. And the brain knows the kind of timbre that every direction around the head results for them. For you, okay? Your brain knows, which is why you hear a bird up to the right, left behind you, and you know exactly where it is. You can turn around and see it, okay? That's extraordinary, and it's all done through the timbre of the sound at your eardrum, which is very unique for different directions. However, if you put a headphone on your ear at the ear canal entrance, these resonances are basically completely altered. Many headphones simply eliminate them. So the timbre that your eardrum is getting is like nothing you've ever heard before. Now, if you're a sound engineer and you use the same pair of headphones all day, all for years, your brain has gotten used to them, and they might work actually fairly well for you, at least for sound mixing. But most people, when they put on headphones, the sound is above their head, behind their head. There's problems with it, and it doesn't really have good timbre. Does that matter? Well, it turns out it doesn't matter a whole lot, because one of the factors of the ear is that there's this compressor. The outer hair cells in the basilar membrane are always adjusting the frequency response of the membrane to optimize the signal to noise ratio for understanding whatever you're doing. So if you put on a pair of headphones, it can sound for a few seconds pretty bad. But after, at least a minute, it's fine. You say, oh, these headphones sounded shitty when I put them on, but it's pretty good now. We can go ahead with this. And that's because the ear has made compensation for the fact that you have a headphone on, but you're not going to get proper localization. And if you actually make the headphone be exactly what's right, that is to say, produce at your eardrum the same timbre that you get from a frontal source, then the difference is extraordinary. You do this for people, and we did this at the Audio Engineering Society in New York. People listened to this, they did the EQ, and wow, they go, that's fantastic. So how do we do this? Well, you have to do the app, you need a loudspeaker, and it's best that it should be a smallish one. And it should be right in front of you. And you should have a little cell phone like an Apple phone with a spectrum analyzer on it. And you can measure the app produces pink noise to test the speaker, and you measure it with your cell phone and you look at it. If it's not nice and linear, you can use the app to adjust it so it's absolutely linear, okay? Then the next step is you sit in front of the speaker and you listen to it, and the app plays alternating noise bands in third octaves. So it starts with 500 hertz, which sounds like, okay? And then it plays a different one, like that. And you adjust the app to make all these different bands sound like in loudness. And it turns out that's a standard thing to do. I didn't invent this. This is called an equal loudness test. There are equal loudness curves published. There's ISO standards for making them. And an interesting thing about the ISO standard for doing an equal loudness curve is the ISO standard says you must measure at least 100 people because they're all so different, it doesn't make any sense to just measure one. That's in the standard, okay? So equal loudness tests are very different for different individuals. What we need to do is find yours. And the app does this. You can do this in 5 minutes if you've done it before, 10 minutes if you're a novice. You just go through these tones and you make them all equally loud, and then you go back and check to make sure that you haven't made a mistake. Do that a couple times and you're accurate. The ISO standard says that people are repeatable to this to 1 plus or minus 1 to be reliably. So you need to get a repeatable equal loudness test for your hearing from a frontal speaker. Then you put on the headphones, so you do it again. Well, it'll be different. The app calculates the difference and calculates the equalization you need to make the headphone be exactly the same as the frontal speaker. That's all automatic. Once you have the speaker data, once you have the headphone data, you're done. You push the button, say, let's listen, and the sound is suddenly wonderful. The app includes a file player. If you're using the Windows app, you can do anything with it. If you've got the AAX one, of course, you can do anything on your board. The VST3 is the same. Unfortunately, cell phones don't let apps capture streaming. So unfortunately, if you want to listen on the cell phone, you've got to put your music on the cell phone first, which is not that hard. So that's the limitation of the app. Questions about the app? Because I know that's a lot to talk about, but that's what it is.
Great. We have another question from MN2HP. every mix engineer has known the problem with the first reflections for decades. Why is
I'm
this
sure they do.
not accepted in the
Yeah.
in room acoustics?
Yeah.
Took me a long time to learn that. And I'm
It's
sure
not obvious.
yeah, I was taught the opposite in college. I was taught that you need your early
Exactly.
reflections to know the dimensions and shape of the room.
Yep. What was the question? You're absolutely right.
Why is it not accepted in room acoustics, the problem with first reflections?
That's a very good
Why do mix
question.
engineers know, but not?
I've been talking about it since 2004, and I've given 50 presentations to this in conferences all over the world, and everybody sits there going, huh? And then people like Barron and Marshall give up and say, oh, this importance of early reflection, everybody applauds. Fields can be very conservative. And I have to say that it's changing, not maybe as fast as I'd like. Steve Barber, of course, is a big fan. He's worked with me for years. Gunnar Engel has been very helpful. Two really great acousticians now, Paul Scarborough and Chris Blair, who have the acoustics firm Acoustics. They just redid the Cincinnati Concert Hall, and they are currently the designers of the new hall, the Geffen Hall in New York City. And they understand. They are, however, limited by a lot of tradition in concert halls. A concert hall has to look like a concert hall or it won't sound like a concert hall. And so what you do, you can't do anything that's really radical, okay? And I've looked at their design for the new Geffen Hall, and they have a great many seats behind the orchestra. That wouldn't be my preference. I wouldn't want to sit there. On the other hand, there's a lot of tourists that come to New York, and you can sell those seats. And you have the problem if you're going to put orchestra on the floor without being in a stage house, you need to do something with the stage house. You know, there's got to be something behind them. And you don't want it to be reflective because that back wall reflection on the stage is not good for proximity. So Chris and Paul have made seats behind the orchestra, but the rest of the hall looks pretty good. So we'll see how it comes out. Yeah, so things are changing. Things are changing.
Good. James Hipperson has asked, is LOC applicable to loudspeaker measurements? And is there anywhere I can view the code or equations to use it? I design loudspeakers and have been searching for a measurement method that directly correlates with perceived proximity for some time. Almost unheard of as a term and concept in loudspeaker engineering, sadly.
The answer to that is the LOC code that I'm using now is available in both C language and MATLAB on my website, davidgriesinger.com. And there's right at the top, it says, if you want the code for LOC, and here it is. I wrote it in MATLAB first because the graphics are very nice, and I'm not good programmer for graphics in C. And my C knowledge it works, but it's rudimentary. So I wrote it in C, and I added something very old-fashioned, you know, chain printer graphics. So if you give the C code an impulse response, it makes a graph with dots and dashes of what the data looks like. But anyway, yes, LOC code is there. I've written pretty much extensively about how it works. And if you're a coder, you can see from the MATLAB or the C exactly how it works. What I'm doing, I didn't describe that because the graph wasn't there. The LOC is just the difference, basically, in the sound pressure in the first 50 milliseconds of a sound from the direct sound. So the sound pressure in the first 80 milliseconds from the direct sound compared to the sound pressure in the first 80 milliseconds from all the reflections when you sum them, okay? And that's a very simple criterion. But if you think about it, there's some interesting things about it. Obviously, if the direct sound in the first 50 milliseconds is sufficiently stronger than the reflections in the first, I say 50, I meant 80 milliseconds, then you're going to hear the direct sound clearly, and that's absolutely true, okay? But there's a wrinkle to it. You can have very strong reflections, but if they don't come in the first 80 milliseconds, then it doesn't affect LOC. So it's very interesting. If you're in a large space where reflections take a long time to get to you, you can localize with proximity at very large distances, even though the direct to reverberant ratio might be very poor. For example, the seat that I didn't play, or I did play for you briefly, in the balcony in Boston Symphony is 110 feet from the source. And that's a big hall, okay? But you wouldn't expect it. The direct to reverberant ratio is like -10 at that seat. And you wouldn't expect it to sound very good at all. But in fact, it's one of the best seats in the hall. And my preference, I would sit there all the time. Okay. So yeah, LOC just, it works about what is the sound pressure in the first 80 milliseconds from the direct sound? What is the sound pressure in the first 80 milliseconds from all the reflections summed? And these graphs that it draws shows you this graphically, and they're interesting to look at.
Thank you. We have some more questions. Do we have any from Facebook, guys?
Not yet.
Okay. We'll keep going from here then.
Okay, I think that's all. Great presentation, David.
Thank you.
We have a lot of material now to study, okay?
Okay.
So, thanks to all GUI moderators. Great work, great support for me.
Big thanks to Abe, because he worked very hard to make this work. We couldn't get
Really?
stereo examples, but I listened to the examples on my computer, and they were kind of garbled a little bit from Zoom, but the stereo was there, and you could really hear what I was trying to talk about. At least I thought so.
Okay.
So thank you, Abe.
No problem. We'll post some links also if people want to hear them again.
Okay, great.
Okay, thanks to all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.